So, a lot of the studying I've been doing lately has to do with not just what is said, but also how we say it. Not just how we understand what happened, but the story we tell, whether it's about ourselves or about God, about the world, about politics, whatever. There's almost always a story, a way of saying things, a way of understanding things that's very important and sometimes very difficult to get at. I was very struck by this importance in the Gospels this week, looking at this passage out of Matthew that we're going to look at in the sacred gathering, and noticing the way Matthew tells the story about the incarnation, about Jesus coming, is very different than the way Luke does, which is very different than the way John does, etc. And it's not that they're not telling the same story about God's coming among us, it's that certain things interest them differently. And so I think we can be in a bad habit at times of kind of harmonizing all of our gospel stories, of skipping back and forth from Matthew to Luke, from Joseph's perspective to Mary's perspective to the wise men to the shepherds, etc. We're used to throwing them all together into this like kind of manger scene when everything gets blended up. But I think when we do that, we maybe miss some of the important things that we're supposed to be seeing in the different ways the different gospels tell the story. Again, maybe that's part of the reason we have four gospels, four different angles, four different ways of telling this story of God's important work coming among us, rather than just a single unified narrative, as seems to be enough telling the story of the disciples in the beginning of the early church, but it's just not enough to tell the story of Jesus. So we're going to look at Matthew chapter 1, starting in verse 18. And it's interesting because the way the Gospel of Matthew starts is not telling this story, but in fact looking backwards. In fact, Matthew is one of the kind of most backward-looking Gospels in a lot of ways, trying to emphasize that God has been up to something. God has been working towards us. This coming in this incarnation is a culmination of a lot of footwork. It's a culmination of a lot of planning as God has been doing. So it's backwards looking, but for some very specific reasons. It starts with a genealogy of going through the names of people and how we got here. And a couple of names really stand out in Matthew. One, he starts with Abraham. He starts with talking about this promise God made to this individual man that not only will you become a large group of people, which happened in the nation of Israel, but everybody in the entire world is going to be blessed one day by someone who is related to you, by one of your descendants. And then he also highlights very heavily a promise made very similarly to David. You're always going to have a king on the throne. Again, as we read the Gospels, it's going to be very different than we're anticipating and expecting, but there is going to be a king. A king is coming, a Messiah who is going to keep up the good work, whose heart is going to be like yours, who's going to be a major piece of this overall plan God is having to restore the world. And so those two figures are going to figure prominently in how Matthew tells the story about this promise to Abraham from the very beginning, about God's long long-standing plans to be among people. This is not a change in direction. This is not a surprise. Another really important thing to talk about in Matthew is just discipleship. That's one of the words that gets associated most heavily with Matthew, and that's just simply how do we apprentice ourselves? How do we follow this God who came and taught kind of ways of being in the world, right? Ways of following him well. And so almost every figure in the Gospel of Matthew is one that we can either learn from directly and imitate them, or they are someone who we kind of say, oh, they aren't getting it. They're not someone we're supposed to be imitating. But discipleship is a really key theme. And so all those things come together, this backward looking, this connection with earlier promises in his choice, once he starts telling the story, not to focus on Mary and all the amazing things that are going on her, but to focus on her husband, Joseph, as how does he connect with the earlier story, and how is he lifted up as an example that we're supposed to learn from for disciples. So, okay, enough introduction. Let me just simply read the beginning of this Matthew again, chapter 1, starting in verse 18. This is how the birth of Jesus Christ took place. When Mary, his mother, was engaged to Joseph before they were married, she became pregnant by the Holy Spirit. Joseph, her husband, was a righteous man. Because he didn't want to humiliate her, he decided to call off their engagement quietly. As he was thinking about this, an angel from the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, don't be afraid to take Mary as your wife, because the child she carries was conceived by the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you will call him Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. Now all of this took place so that what the Lord had spoken through the prophet would be fulfilled. Look, a virgin will become pregnant and give birth to a son. They will call him Emmanuel. Emmanuel means God with us. When Joseph woke up, he did just as the angel from God commanded, and he took Mary as his wife. But he didn't have sexual relations with her until she gave birth to a son. Joseph called him Jesus. So this kind of backwards focus, this interest in of Jesus' life as a culmination, this kind of pointing backwards to Old Testament figures kind of cuts both ways, right? Not only does it point out that Jesus is part of a long line of kind of heroes of the faith, people who have followed and trusted God well, but if you look at the Old Testament, we've focused specifically on these characters of Abraham and David. They are most certainly not people without their flaws, right? And again, this is important to point out because a figure like Abraham, a guy who is going to found a nation, we have stories about these sorts of figures. We have stories about kings like David from other cultures in the world at the time. And I can tell you, if there's one thing that they did not do, it was show them as flawed human beings. They're superhuman, right? They're people who conquer dragons. They're people who found these great nations and are flawless and perfect. I mean, they're mythology figures in so many ways. The Bible is very unique in considering how old it is, and yet it has a very strong interest in recording their flaws and talking about that these are very ordinary humans with fears who make huge mistakes often, and yet God is able to work through kind of people like that. He empowers and strengthens and works through ordinary, flawed people. And a genealogy is not going to remind us just of flaws. It's also going to remind us these are people who are faithful and trusted God, and God was able to work through. And so the tension between flawed, ordinary humanity and the good God who can work in and through them shows up right again in this figure of Joseph, right? We learn through that through the lineage that I didn't read that David he's of royal blood, right? And yet this dynasty is not a real impressive one at this time. He's a carpenter. He's probably living more or less like a day laborer at times. We know they were very, very poor, just based on the sacrifices from Luke, etc. We're told they can only afford the absolute bare minimum, that only the poorest of the poor were allowed to use as sacrifices. So we know the Davidic dynasty it is going is not producing the most impressive kings at this point. It's producing people like Joseph, who are easy to look at and be unimpressed by. I'm also a little curious why throughout this gospel and all of them, God doesn't seem to want to clean it up and make it as simple and easy, as obvious as maybe we would prefer at times, right? God comes through an angel directly to Mary, and he tells her she's going to become pregnant. Joseph doesn't find out about this apparently until after the fact. She is pregnant. He makes the assumption that most of us would, that she's cheated on him. And then only after this thing is happening one way or another, God comes to him in a dream, not in as obvious of a way, and is going to give him a choice. Are you going to believe me and trust me, even though it's pretty easy if we want to disregard our dreams, right? Yet Joseph knew somehow, and he is offered, again, here's that discipleship piece, the opportunity for obedience, to take on something because he knows something now about what is going on with Mary that basically no one is probably going to believe them on, right? She has this shame of being an unwed mother in front of her. This beautiful thing has happened. God has come, and by his own spirit, he has generated a human being within Mary. A very specific sign, as Matthew likes to point out, again, backwards looking, that God is working again in the world, that God is coming to be among people. And Joseph, like all disciples, has a choice. Will he obey and join her in what is a beautiful, incredible thing that most people won't believe and will even interpret shamefully? Does Joseph, in a highly patriarchal culture, marry her anyway, taking on, all the shame of a cuckolded husband, which is it's not going to be as bad as it is for Mary, but still, people are not going to respect him because he knows the truth. He knows that God is at work, and it doesn't matter to him ultimately what other people see. He has the choice to be part of this amazing miracle that God is up to that most people are going to miss, and he's even going to have to bear some shame probably over. I also really like the specific words that Joseph is given that are not told to Mary. Mary has a very different reaction. Mary is told things very differently. But in Joseph, this kind of hands-off, a little more distant approach, he is told in the dream something very important and very specific about not just the virgin will become pregnant, and they're going to call him Emmanuel. They are going to call him God is with us. And so Joseph, from the get-go, understands the Messiah, understands this long line of promises, understands this blessing that is going to come from Abraham in a very unique and special way. The message he gets is not just that his wife, his future wife, hasn't been unfaithful and that he can be part of this amazing thing that God is up to. He also gets one of the first hints that this isn't just a king like David was a king. This isn't just a blessing like Abraham was meant to be a blessing. There's something really unique here, that this child is God with us, God coming to be among us and with us. And this theme actually kind of runs through the entire Gospel of Matthew. It starts with this theme, God is with us. And Jesus, at the very end of Matthew, as he sends his disciples out into the world again as good disciples, as good followers of them, says in the Great Commission again, no matter where you go, I will be with you. There were probably a lot of times in Joseph's life when he is running for his life from political murder, when he is trying to protect this new baby and his new wife, when he has to go and live in other places, it might not feel like God is with him, right? It probably is going to feel that way for the disciples as they are baffled by Jesus, as they go and begin forming this movement that it becomes the church. And God is with us after Jesus left us, and he's with us in the Holy Spirit, right? And yet these figures do something very unique to disciples, and that's even though they don't fully understand, they obey. Joseph goes back. He trusts what God is up to, even though he doesn't fully understand it. And so this little story about Joseph having an opportunity to leave and yet making a choice, this fallen dynasty that he represents, this culmination of so much work that God has been up to, just reminds us of a couple of important things that I think the gospel stories are always telling us. Again, the entire history of Israel is reminding us of the fact that God saves. God is working in history. God is working with flawed individuals. I think one of the interesting things about God with us that we need to remember at Christmas is we as religious people have kind of a bad habit of talking about spiritual things that are like beyond the everyday. We want to transcend the everyday and our everyday needs, right? The ordinary and the transcendent. But God with us means the transcendent is leaving behind this kind of ghostly version of spirituality that we are so often trying to put on God, and he's coming towards us, taking on physicality, taking on our flesh. He's moving toward us and the ability to be limited, the ability to be in pain, etc. And again, that theme of God saving his people in Egypt, God living with them in the wilderness, God creating a temple and a tabernacle so he can be with them, God with us has been the Old Testament theme. This is not a new theme. It's just concentrated differently in a single person, even though the country of Israel, the King David, the patriarch Abraham, even Joseph and Mary are very ordinary, very limited people whom God is using and empowering and changing the world through. And just like Joseph gets the invitation, once he sees and understands what God is up to, the question is, will you obey? Will you follow? Will you be formed as I want you to be? Is my story, the way I'm telling this story, even though it catches you off guard and you don't always understand what's going on, will you follow? Will you trust? Will you obey? I think that is something we can learn from Joseph, who did all those things really well.